So what does the current meta look like? Now I'm not going to do a full breakdown of all the tournaments, but we're doing a closer look today at how Genestealer Cult players are doing well, and then, as has been requested so many times, my current 2000 point competitive Genestealer Cult list. And I'm showing that off because some people seem to think I have a clue what I'm talking about when it comes to Genestealer Cult. And I do, so that confidence in me is appreciated. Now the factions that are doing well in the meta tend to have toughness and speed. So we're seeing Custodes and they're using fancy light shenanigans to fly all over the board. We're seeing Imperial Guard with really big tanks. Not necessarily all Imperial Guard armies, but they're showing off their really big super heavies. The Eldari are still up there, and they're still fast. And there's Necrons, both with the Canoptic Court, which has very fast wraiths, and the Hypercrypt Legion, which is teleporting all over the place, and Necrons are very tough anyway, especially the Catan. And also Grey Knights. They teleport all over the place, and their most basic troops have a 2+ save. That's very tough, that's very fast, that's what we're dealing with. But the meta at tournaments at the moment, which factions are doing well, is going to vary quite a bit. In some places, the Imperial Guard just do very badly. In some places, there are no Sisters players whatsoever, and in others, the tournaments are won by Sisters. So your mileage may vary. This is good. It means we've got a pretty healthy meta. We're not seeing the Death Guard crushed like they were at the start of the edition. We're not seeing Eldari literally everywhere. I know that the World Eaters have a small roster of units that forces them to play one way competitively, but all factions are seeing some sort of good innings. We're not at the start of the edition meta where everyone was enjoying dwarf kicking, but now they have stood up to their full height of just over 50%. And Games Workshop is updating the rules very often. Every 3 months is quite regular, so this isn't going to last. It may not feel regular if you're playing multiple times a week, but it is coming very quickly if you're playing just once a month. Although if Games Workshop wants to do a rules update every single month, that would be just great. Those update videos get me so many views. Okay, but my point is, this is a snapshot of the meta, and it will probably change again near the end of April. At the start of 10th edition for Genestealer Cult, we were seeing the same sort of Genestealer Cult lists. Something basically like this. A large block of Acolytes with a Primus and Nexus, a large block of Neophytes with a Primus and Nexus, another large block of Acolytes with a Primus and Nexus, and all of these Acolytes have demo charges. Or at least, as many Acolytes with demo charges are allowed. Then you'd have Infiltrating Aberrants with a Biophagus. They're cheaper than an Abominant by 25 points, and now that the points have changed, by 15 points. There would be a Ridgerunner, and perhaps a Brood Brothers tank with indirect fire like a Manticore or a Basilisk, and then as many Saboteurs as you can fit. Perhaps also a Clamavus. And towards the end of 2023 we were seeing a very similar thing. Colton Cox placed first at the Mad Alpaca Grand Tournament, and there were 2 Clamavus, a lot of Primuses, a whole bunch of Neophytes, and a whole bunch of Acolytes. There wasn't that much of a meta shift since the start of the edition, but since the September patch stopped free command points on anything except battle tactics, that's where we saw that there were no free Return of the Shadows, no second use of tunnel crawlers, and then the Nexus were dropped pretty much completely by everyone. Other than that, Genestealer Cult meta lists have stayed pretty much the same. Until recently. And I like this change because now the competitive Genestealer Cult lists look a lot more like my competitive Genestealer Cult list, which I will get into. But this means that either tournament attendees playing Genestealer Cult are watching my videos and taking useful notes, or they are meta geniuses and I had the same thought as them. Either way, my ego is very flattered. There is a new Genestealer Cult meta strategy, and it's seen success in the week since the January balance patch. It's all about putting pressure on the enemy immediately. The older meta list I showed off is about having a second or third turn strikes, with only the Aberrants to hold up the enemy if you have Aberrants. But now we're seeing more Purestrain Genestealers, more Brood Brothers that are not the Basilisks, but they're Catachans in a Taurus for their scout move of 6 inches. We don't necessarily need to use a Chimera because we're not issuing orders from within, that's the Chimera special rule. The Taurus is cheaper by 5 points and it lets the unit advance and then get out, so we can have bodies on objectives immediately while the opponent is still tied up with Purestrains and Aberrants. So here's a list by Matanza at the Art of War tournament that had 97 players, and their only loss was to a load of Tyrannid monsters, but they were using the Invasion Fleet detachment, not the Crusher Stampede detachment. If anything, this is just suitable for Genestealer Cult lore. The Genestealer Cult list has 30 Purestrains and a Catachan squad in a Chimera. We are still seeing a lot of the Primus. Full rerolls to hit are very nice. There is one Nexus. You will see that I also recommend having one Nexus. There's just one set of Acolytes with demolition charges, and then a lot of Neophytes doing the lifting, because there we have seismic cannons, we have grenade launchers. If you're going to use a perfect ambush, which you can do on 2 units because of the Nexus, then all of these weapons are getting an extra point of armor penetration. Seismic cannons are very short range, but that works when we're coming from reserve. Grenade launchers get a lot of shots, which are made better if they're AP -1. And the Achilles Ridgerunners are supporting to improve that armor penetration even more. The Genestealers hold the enemy, the Neophytes strike, and hold objectives. And at the Alliance Open 40k Masters tournament with 45 players, there was a list that had 40 Catachans in Chimeras and a Taurox, as well as 10 Genestealers and 30 Acolytes. You push the enemy hard, you maintain that pressure, they can't get out of their deployment zone. If they're using some kind of stratagem or shenanigan to teleport away, they can't if they're in close combat. At Collector Mania, there was another list, Purestrains and Infiltrating Aberrants, keeping the enemy held in their deployment zone. I'm not going to go into any more detail about any other lists because I'm going to show off my own very similar list. So this is my 2000 point competitive list. My current one. I change it a lot. I've had a Sanctus, I've had more Acolytes with Demolition Charge, I have dropped the Nexus in the past, I have had Metamorphs or Catachans or Cadians for sticky objectives, or heavy weapons teams instead of the Sentinel, but this works right now for me. Looking at this army list and having seen the meta lists, there is one weird unit that I often include that I always get asked about. I kept being asked, why have you included that for the 1000 point tournament list? That unit is the Patriarch. Now that's a little bit of a mind game. They see, okay, we've got Acolytes, they blow stuff up, we've got Aberrants, they're tough, and we have a Patriarch. What does the Patriarch do? They don't know. Maybe they ask and I tell them, yeah, it's about the devastating wounds. That is their main ability, plus the fear bubble. That is bad for Imperial Guard players. Because if the Genestealers tear through their front ranks and the Guard die while battle shocked, then they cannot return by the reinforcement stratagem. This was in the most recent rules commentary. If you die while battle shocked, you cannot use stratagems on that unit. You bypass the rules bit that they're not on the table because they're dead, but you don't bypass the rules bit that you can't use stratagems on a battle shocked unit. And I have played Genestealer Cult against Imperial Guard enough times to know that they bring back more models and units than we do. And that is our whole army special rule. The other reason I have the Patriarch is so I can use the Epic Challenge stratagem. So in the first turn, if I'm not advancing the Genestealers, then I may want to be using that. A lot of light characters exist, and they have 3 or 4 wounds and a not amazing save. So this is another character that can use Epic Challenge and kill characters alongside the Abominant. In 10th edition, characters can be the life of a lot of armies. If they are dead, then a unit's abilities go away, and their utility goes way down. There was a reason that Vindicares were so popular at the start of the edition, and my Deathwatch are enjoying Eliminators. The Genestealers, I have a unit of 10 and a unit of 5. 3 units of 5 would work, but I like to have 10 together to get the devastating wounds from the Patriarch. The reason for the unit of 5 is to hold objectives that I infiltrated onto, and having 2 Purestrain Genestealer units means that statistically I should get one of them back. Purestrains are great when coming from Cult Ambush. Other units will end up far out of position because they need to be to stay safe. Maybe they'll be able to do a little bit of shooting. But because Purestrains can run and charge as soon as they are back, they're able to fight immediately. If I can, I will have them die on my turn, so that I then get them back sooner as they pop up immediately on the enemy's next turn, and I don't really miss a turn with them. They're just in another part of the battlefield. Remember that enemies cannot choose not to fight in close combat the way they can choose not to shoot you. Often I'm able to take the enemy's home objective just with Genestealers that have respawned. If they respawn. We have the Abominant. She is infiltrating along with the Aberrants. Just 5 Aberrants because I found that 10 is a lot of a points investment, and 10 can get tied up by some enemy units, or just left behind. And while we do have Return to the Shadows, that is better on Battleline units because you get 2 Battleline units, or that 1 Aberrant unit, and the Aberrants are still going to end up having to try and make a 9-inch charge after returning. They often fail for me. So having 5 is a small unit that can tie up the enemy. If you string them out in a line, it's covering the same distance as 10 of them, because of how unit coherency works. It's the same size wall that's smashing into them. The Abominant hits very powerfully, but 3 attacks only, that's why sustained hits are very useful for her, so my opponents have gotten to know Big Hammer Lady. And the Aberrants can smash Custodes with their damage 3 weapons. The unit is very tough to shift. We know this. You could even say they're unkillable. They're not, but it takes a lot of effort, and while the enemy is putting more and more effort into killing them, I'm scoring victory points. I control the rest of the battlefield. They are still in their deployment zone, which is about to become my deployment zone. The next unit is the Primus. Now I include just one because after the first one, their usefulness drops, because then you can only make use of one of their abilities, not both. As long as you have one Primus, you can move units off the table into reserves. This is something I talked about with the mind games. We can put units on the table, the enemy deploys a bunch of units, but I know those units are going to go into reserve. I could even put the Genestealers and the Aberrants in my deployment zone and then redeploy them using the infiltrate rule. That's so I know if I want to do a refused flank or if there's one unit I really want to tie down as soon as possible. I like to put the Primus with Acolytes because then their demolition charges are far more likely to hit and do so with a bang. They are, in theory, one shot, once per game. You can put the Primus in a Neophyte units because the Acolytes already have a built-in reroll of 1, but I like those demo charges to work. The points of the Acolyte are optimized for having demolition charges. If we're not making the most of the demolition charges, I'm not sure I would want to include the Acolytes. But once they have thrown their demolition charges, they're on combat duty, and so I have one heavy mining tool just so they always have that extra punch. The Locus is also in the squad. As enemies competitively are so varied, we need to be able to deal with shooting and with combat. The Ascension Day detachment is great for anti-shooting stuff. We have one with darkness. We can return to the shadows to get closer to their gun lines. But against combat armies like the Custodes, like the Orcs, like the World Eaters, fight first makes them very sad. All the Custodes players I have fought have had to try it and hope that they survive so that they can slay my Acolytes. Only one managed. That was the surviving part, not the slaying the Acolytes part. They lost too many Custodes to wipe me out. And Focus of Adoration is on the Locus, so that we may be able to heroically intervene, and unlike normal heroic interventions, we have fight first, we fight first. The Ridgerunner is there to boost the others. I have the Augur so that we always ignore cover. I know that we get to ignore cover when we come up from deep strike, but cover is everywhere. And I've chosen the heavy mining laser because I like to do damage. Other people like to use the mortar for crossfire, and then you can do so while out of line of sight. It's personal preference, but we need to get at least one hit on the enemy, and that's why I like to have the twin heavy stubbers in line of sight for more shots. One of them should hit. When shooting, the Ridgerunner goes first. Next, the 10 Acolytes come out. With tunnel crawlers, they can be right next to the enemy with demo charges, use the demo charges, and the demo charges are made better with a perfect ambush. Now we're hitting on a 4+ at AP -3, and then with the Primus rerolling, we're getting a lot of shots. Whatever they hit should disappear. Not every time, because we have some enemies that reduce damage by 1, like the Catan, but there's another thing we have to help us deal with them. The Nexus with the Neophytes comes next. The Nexus lets us use a perfect ambush a second time, so that is the correct order. Usually these Neophytes are attacking the unit that the Ridgerunner hit. Because their demolition charges are already AP -2, the Acolytes will usually push enemies onto their invulnerable save if they have one, but that's common for units like Wraiths and Custodes. The Neophytes hitting with a perfect ambush and crossfire are now AP -2. So again, that's usually enough to push Custodes onto their invulnerable save and to wipe out the save entirely from units like Imperial Guard. I like to equip them with Webbers to bypass invulnerable saves, though not the Custodes, because they now have an ability again that ignores devastating wounds. And I like grenade launchers because that's going to be a lot of shots at AP -2. And then there's seismic cannons. Seismic cannons can do multiple damage, that's why I want to include them. And I gave the Nexus Prowling Adjutant so that we can stay out of combat if possible and then return to the shadows. something that we can't do if we are in close combat. And I have the Reductus Sabatour. Whichever unit gets past the Genestealers and the Aberrants first, as long as they're near to her, and she's going to be on one of the objectives, they're going to take a bunch of mortal wounds. So unless the enemy can get their chaff through, in which case the Genestealers and the Aberrants are now fighting their more elite units, the chaff will explode. What normally happens is the chaff gets taken out by Genestealers, and then the more elite units come forward and they're the ones that get hit, and the mortal wounds caused are much more impactful. The Reductus Sabatour wants to be out of line of sight, and then she can move forward, free grenade stratagem, and a demolition charge. We can advance and still use the grenade stratagem and still use the demolition charge. The 5 Acolytes, I have them with mining weapons. They could have demolition charges, but all of my demolition charge models are on the 10 Acolyte unit. The 5 of them hold an objective, and because they are objective control 2, they are better than Metamorphs and they are better than Genestealers. If needs be, they can charge in and mess up some enemies. The 10 Neophytes are on the home objective to generate command points. They have a mining laser and heavy stubber. The heavy stubber gets a lot of shots. And flamers. They are basically the spare models, but the flamers are there to counter the enemy deep strike. Scourgers will only try it once. The Scout Sentinel is another unit that's moving up the board quickly, and it's there to put a little bit more pressure on the enemy. From my turn 1, I can be on an objective. Because of their profile, they're a little bit annoying to get rid of. You have to actually commit some firepower to it, including anti-tank shots. And that means that anti-tank shots are not going towards the bigger tank. I have the Shadowsword for 2 main reasons. It's there at 2,000 points to take out the big things. 2,000 points has things like Necron Monoliths, Catan, Angron. Even when they're halving damage, multiple shots at damage 12 can put them down. Ideally, they wouldn't have an invulnerable save, but that's where the devastating wounds ability comes in. If you roll a 6 and you're targeting the right thing, then it'll go straight through onto their feel no pain, if they have one. The Shadowsword is great for getting rid of enemy big tanks, and the Scout Sentinel is there to spot for it. While we can't have Lord Solar Leontus giving us an extra ballistic skill, and then being heavy so we stay still, and then we're hitting on 2+, and then with the Sentinel re-rolling 1s, so that we're almost always going to hit, we'll just have to be satisfied with 3+ to hit re-rolling 1s. Imperial Guard are taking these quite often, and they are succeeding at tournaments. Not all the time, but we're seeing these appear in the tournament winning lists. The second reason I take a Shadowsword is perhaps the most important. It doesn't take up as much space in the box as 500 points worth of infantry. That means I can transport an army much easier. But there is more on this point. Fewer units means I can put more focus on the troops that matter. More command points can be spent on good combos. And it's the infantry that hold objectives and win the game. Not that the tank with objective control 8 is anything to sniff at. But seriously, adding a big tank helps me because I like to play at 1500 points. I put in that and the Scout Sentinel, and there is no extra thinking needed from me. I can still use all the Genestealer Cult stratagems, so I don't need to rethink how I use them or when. And I think that's a good place to end. So watch this video on which stratagems I use, in what turn I use them, on what units and why. My darlings and viewers, have a great day of 40k.